Reflection has been, and perhaps always will be, a plague upon the human psyche. The way shapes morph and laugh and mock the observer, as though one could possibly exist without the other. The creatures that lurk behind our walls of glass are not creatures of natural conception. No. These creatures are created in the glass, not by light that bounces from our glamour-obsessed flesh, but from the horrid poisons we let fester in our brains. The looking glass, in that sense, is aptly named. It shows not how one appears, but rather displays to the observer an opportunity to look upon the darkened corners of their mind. A dream, perhaps, locked away behind a wall of glass. I've never feared this dream, a mistake I shan't continue to make. For in this vile place that I so foolishly sought out, I met the dreamer and learnt an awful truth. The town overlooked my destination, a sprawling forest perhaps a kilometre from the furthest house. What horror, that house. Each of the houses, if they could be called such a name, seemed to have crawled from beneath the ground they now rest upon. Some had roots darting between their shingles, whilst others sported boulders of indescribable size upon their sloped slate roofs. The bright colours of the roots created criss-cross patterns across the mud-stained tiles. One house seemed to blend with the dirt below, even sprouting worms and mice within the walls. The furthest house was different, however. It too seemed sprung from the earth, and it too housed earthen features such as the tree erect in its centre. Oddly, however, at a distance the tree seemed hardly a sapling, yet stood at the doorstep that very same tree now towered hundreds of metres into the air. What's more was the effect on the houses behind. Turning to face them revealed crumbling ruins, now overrun by mice and foliage. How peculiar. I'm not sure what dastardly presence it was that possessed me to approach the door of that decrepit shack, nor of that which led me to knock. And yet I knocked. I knocked on the hardwood door, and an echo rang loud through the nothingness that surrounded me. It must have been an age that I knocked for. All around my feet, leaves fell from the tall women of lumber, now towering higher than was conceivable from the victim of my knocking. A shadow had been cast, interrupted intermittently by patches of missing foliage. Said foliage, resting upon the soil, now seemed so dense that one wouldn't be called a fool were they to describe this as the forest I sought. I continued to knock. The leaves continued to fall. The way the branches rattled in the wind, it was as though the tree were mocking me, laughing, dropping confetti in an attempt at false gratitude. I continued to knock, in spite of my heckler, in spite of the blood now staining my knuckles. One last knock, then I'll put to rest this intrigue of mine. I raised my closed fist, hurtling it toward the door that, for an eternity, had met me with naught but an echo. My fist was instead caught by another. In search of the wooded path, are we? Her words trickled out through a crooked smile. Where once stood a shack at the edge of a crumbling town, now stood an elder tree and a woman draped in a tattered dress at its base. A rotting stench littered the air between us. You know, most who decide that the wooded path shall be where they lay their feet are not met so kindly by the words of their peers. The door just... She laughed a sharp laugh and pressed two of her blackened fingers to her forehead. To see, to dream of you. I see like you see the wood. Oh, I haven't a doubt you'll find her. I don't don't understand. There was a shack. I was knocking. The woman leapt forward, revealing the necrotic flesh that hid beneath her veil of clothing, droplets of bloody spittle licking my cheek. Transferring her hand to my own forehead, she whispered, "The dead mother is alive." The vile creature fell limp to her knees, cackling and muttering nonsense to herself. I reached out once more to knock on the door that I knew had to be there, hidden by these devilish delusions of mine. My fist fell to its lonesome, as I found myself stood likewise upon the goal of my journey, the wooded path. This forest, the wooded path as that thing had called it, seemed impossible. A maze of sorts, where consulting cardinal directions was meaningless. Sprung tall from the soil stood great trees of various types. Oak, willow, pine, even gum trees found home upon the wooded path. Each one watching, feeling. They didn't move, yet a sense of presence could be felt emanating from each lumbering husk. The way they leant over the path, the way their roots dug so unimaginably deep into the soil below. Festering. Much like the elder tree that cackled at my knocking, their leaves rattled in the wind, a wind so foreign from those of recent recollection. Wind often carries with it pleasant scents and clouds of topsoil, and wind that is fierce often howls and bites with its strength. Yet this wind, the one that haunts the wooded path, does not howl, nor does it carry with it any pleasant scent. This wind, still as it seems, bites and forces its way into every crevice upon every entity upon the path. The dirt seemed unaffected, the trees and shrubbery still as a painting, yet I found myself fighting against the spectre in the wind. And then the leaves. Despite the stillness of everything within the portrait, the leaves cackled in the wind just like the ones upon the elder tree, swaying. A breeze ferocious like that of a storm, carrying the green husks. So peculiar to find that the wind's effect was exclusive to myself and the leaves of all things. Perhaps their rattling was the echo of another's laughter. Someone deeper. I marched onward. Deeper. Never mind that moving onward always led back to the birthplace of the march. Some time had passed upon the wooded path. Weeks, perhaps months. Time was not of much concern in this place. It passed in ways it ought not to in a logical world. But alas, this was no logical place. Memories of that vile creature, my only companion from the prior world I walked. The smell of her carrion still haunting. It burrowed so deep within my nostrils. God, it festers. Such a vile, vile creature she had been. I added a patch of red bile to the growing collection upon the rim of my now tattered dress. Rot's stench grew more pungent. The maze-like nature of the wooded path had begun to take its toll on the state of my being. I was lonely, save for the trees. Their bark had begun to dry, flaking from trunks and in some cases falling to the dirt below. The wooded path was aging. I continued my wander. At the tree with the striking white bark and a tally carved into its side, I noticed marks had been left on the ground. Footprints, I suppose. With nary a sense of direction nor rationale, I followed them. 5 steps forward, then 5 more. A left, then 15 more steps. Right at the pine whose leaves had been wilted beyond any stage of recognition. 19 steps forward, then another left at the towering willow. Her deep roots gnawed at the soles of my feet. 47 more steps, a familiar sight. I had surely walked at least 150 meters outward from that tree. Yet here it stood. The same striking white bark, the same chattering leaves, the same footprints in the dirt. All that had changed was the tally. It had increased. 2 carved lines. I attempted once more, met with a third upon my return. The stench of that hag's carrion limbs even worse than before. Bile painted the tally. As darkness engulfed the wooded path, the first darkness to do so in many years, I was greeted by the pleasantry of a brightened horizon. A campfire burnt, filling the ghoulish wind with a smoky scent. At last. Lonesomeness, the most devilish of all the plagues, could be cured. Shielding the full light from warming my eyes stood a figure, hunched over and watching. They did not move, did not beckon, just watched. She appeared, through the blur of our distance, to be dressed not too unlike myself, though her dress stood still in the silent wind. I stretched out a hand from my side, a desperate plea for communication. The figure watched. Eager to leave behind the stench of rotten bile, my feet began to march, or rather, scramble. Messily, I ran toward my observer, pleading with unsuccessful waves.
"Look at me. See me and give welcome."
They watched. I was not sure they had truly seen me. It seemed, in my disheveled foray, that my observer was moving farther away the closer I approached. I ran, walked, jogged, even crept toward them at varying speeds. Unsuccessful. No matter the distance I covered, no matter the impossibility of the nature, my observer always seemed to be some 200 meters apart from me. That's not to say that they had moved. They stood perfectly still, watching, yet eternally distant. The darkness grew faster. Some several hours had passed since the blanket began to fall. The stench of that vile hag still rotted in my nasal cavity. Suddenly, fear struck. This observer of mine who defies logic, could they be the woman from the shack? Hairs stood tall atop my flesh, my living flesh. She was following me. She must have been. I had wandered for centuries upon the wooded path, eternally alone, and now stood my first taste of companionship, save for that haunting stench.
But why her? Of all entities that might, in some dastardly, ungodly way, call this place their home, it is the one who rots my very being that greets me first. No.
Anxiety flowing through my red rivers, I turned on my heels and ran. I froze almost immediately. There, stood some 200 meters across, was another creature. Much like that vile hag, this one sported carrion in place of flesh, the smell pungent even from a distance. This creature seemed lost, however, afraid even. We locked eyes, and the freeze consumed me. Hunched over in a position ready for a sprint, I watched as she did likewise. Watched as she ran, as her existence jittered between places, this one and another. Like static on an old television, she seemed to phase from one state to another. She had raised her hand to wave only for some invisible remote to change the channel. She was pleading, in every state trying desperately to reach me. I just watched. It wasn't long before, in a blink, she was gone, the remote switching off. Rotten stench still filled my nostrils. I turned back to face my own observer. No luck. I no longer stood upon familiar ground. The wooded path had contorted. Perhaps the remote had changed my channel this time. As I had walked the wooded path, this place in which time was a poison, the tall women of lumber had watched from above, their chorus of chattering leaves mocking my every step. They were present with the illusion of life. From their trunks grew curtains of green and brown and amber and laughter.
Devilish laughter.
Each tree felt my every step with their burrowed roots. I could feel them reaching upward, hoping to drag me down to their hollow underworld. They exerted so much presence, these husks. Yet still, I saw only that. Husks. For these trees, alive as they were, still were not affected by the roaring, dead wind. These trees, despite their latching to the soil and colourful chorus, were drier upon touch than any I'd encountered prior. They were not dead, perhaps that much was true, but they were certainly not living their lives as other trees might do. In such respect, they seemed not so distant from that vile hag in the shack. Her carrion flesh and decrepit stature, her rotted idea of vocabulary. By all means, she was not dead, yet she seemed to inhabit some place other than life. They lingered between worlds, the trees and the hag. But now, I faced something different, older. In the center of a clearing, I spied another tree. Unlike its static sisters that lingered above my wander, this tree did not tower, nor did it seem unaware of the wind. As the silent howl roared between my legs, carrying with it loose fabric from the now tattered dress that hid my flesh, the branches of this lonesome tree began to dance, swaying in the wind. I might have heard the faintest hint of a breeze. This tree, unlike so many I had passed prior, had a familiar presence, one that welcomed intrusion. A presence that fills the lungs, that exerts an experience of many eons and hopes to tell the many thoughts it had learnt. This tree, unlike so many others, had the presence of life. And yet, the poor thing's bark had begun to rot. Leaves were absent upon this dying stump, as was any colour save for crimson and grey. The dry, dying flesh of a once magnificent tree was now churned and twisted in a horrific image, like that of a rotting corpse.
Wait, hadn't I just noticed crimson?
I scanned the bark once more, searching for what colour it held, and there, in speckled streaks across the middle of the trunk, lay crimson bark. Flesh. This magnificent tree, older than any upon the wooded path, with a presence so warm and open to those who may visit, was plagued across the chest by my most torturous pursuer. Carrion. The vile stench that had infested my nostrils, that awful image of the decrepit woman in the shack, and now this beautiful tree, tarnished. I laughed a laugh unlike any I had before. Laughter is often placed in one's throat at the advent of hilarity. Its meaning, to stir a mirroring amongst the peers that may listen. This laughter, however, was the laughter of defeat. A laughter that was carried by the cackling chorus.
Of course.
The echo that rang through the wooded path, the silent wind that rattled every leaf upon every tree, was nothing but the laughter of my defeated self. Upon my knees, I looked up at the rotting tree, a horrid smile still kissing my lips. I saw it. Standing level, the revelation had hidden from me, but crouched below, I saw the elder tree. The tree that had sprung from that vile shack, had laughed at and mocked me, that had shrunk me down to naught but an ant, and birthed around me this dastardly wooded path. This place was a living thing, and stood before me was its dead mother. Withering, rotting, but in every sense of the word, alive. The laughter churned bloody bile from my gut, littering the belly of the wooded path. My head spun. I reached out, as I had when last I stood in front of this horrid creature, and threw my fist against the hardwood door I knew with all my being had to still be there. It landed. A wooden door blocked light from entering a run-down old shack. To the right, a leather armchair held its back to me. Marks on the ground said it had been moved recently. Behind, the shallow roots of a sapling hung like darkened fairy lights from the ceiling. I turned my eyes to the table by the door. Upon it stood a mirror. It had been so long since last I saw my reflection. I had been wandering that wooded path for so many years. Eons. I gazed in and saw a vile sight. The face of that vile hag. She looked at me, eyes wide and tired. A vile grin sucked bile from her rotting lips, bile that had been placed there by none other than myself. The room began to spin as the words of that hag echoed in my mind.
The dead mother.
I looked once more to the roots in the ceiling as the now dropped mirror shattered at my feet, seeing in their place the towering trunk of the elder tree. The dead mother. Alive, watching, mocking. Yet it wasn't the laughter of her botanical chorus that most startled my nerves, nor was it the vile whispers of the hag in my ear. No. Both sounds, awful as they were, paled in comparison to the familiar knock I heard at the door. I placed myself within the comfort of the armchair, body rattling like that of the chorus above me. I would not answer. Soon she would leave. I would remain alone in this place with the dead mother and her leaves. My visitor at the door was but a dream, and I, the dreamer. I searched for lucidity in a hope I may silence that haunting sound. The knocking continued.